Okay, I think we're maybe going to make a start, so if you can grab a seat, please. There are some people that are still going to be joining us a bit later, but I think we should start. So, hello and welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all, so many people here today for this hopefully very inspiring and interesting talk that we have planned for you today. Particularly welcome to those people that are joining us online. So this is our first streamed event, so it's great to have people potentially tuning in from all over the world that are also unfortunately not here in Stockholm to hear Dean's talk. But a big welcome to everyone. There are so many, I think, new and familiar faces here today, so thank you for joining us. My name is Kat McElroy, and I'm the chairperson of Trans Film Fest Stockholm, which is a very new organisation, sort of a grassroots trans community organisation, which just started really last summer around a kitchen table in Hornstull. So we have had, this is now our third event. We started with ambitious plans to have, to try and create safer spaces and places, community places, for trans people, have an interesting, fun, engaging and welcoming and empowering experience. So that's what we hope today will also be. We started, as I said, very much thinking that we will start and have a film festival. We'll try and do as much of that as we can with a very, very small, limited budget. But we were able to do that on the 21st of November when we marked Trans Day of Remembrance last year. And then we decided to be even more ambitious and create a 4-day Trans Fest Stockholm event, which was then starting the 31st of March to mark Trans Day of Visibility. So this is our third event, and we are very happy to be able to host this, obviously with the support of many different organisations, but particularly ABF Stockholm for this wonderful venue, and also then the Gender Studies Department of Södertörn University, who transported very kindly Dean to Stockholm for this event. So thanks to our supportive organisations and also groups. But particularly I would like to acknowledge both Andreas and Niels from Cooperativet Levende Video, who are here today and very much supporting and sponsoring the online streaming. So thank you very much to Niels and Andreas for facilitating that, so thank you. I just have some practical things to say before I introduce Dean. We have toilets just out the doors here to the left, at the end of the corridor. There are gender toilets and also then a gender-neutral wheelchair accessible toilet. The codes are on the door here. It's 0203 for the gender toilets and 2020 for the gender-neutral / wheelchair accessible toilets. So they're on the door here, and also you can ask anyone with a t-shirt to get the code. If there are lots of people that want to use the gender-neutral toilets, downstairs on the first floor at the entrance of the building, there are very many gender-neutral toilets, and the code there is also 0203. We have Wi-Fi also, and if anyone needs it, well, it's probably too late. But there is Wi-Fi in the building. I will also, before I introduce Dean, just to let you know the sort of format of this afternoon. Dean will speak for about 40 minutes, and there will be time for a couple of questions, specifically addressing Dean's talk, clarification questions. We will take a short break, and then we will all come back again for the panel discussion. We have some great panelists who will be reflecting on Dean's talk in a sort of more Swedish or broader European context in relation to also academia and activism. And there will be greater time there for then more input and questions. So if you need a bit of extra time to think about something, particularly if you've been inspired by Dean's talk, then please know that there will be opportunity. Welcome. There'll be opportunity to ask questions or make comments later on as well too. So and we will welcome. We will ask if you also would like to join us afterwards. Dean has agreed to come downstairs to the cafe. This building closes at 4 o'clock, but the cafe is open later, so we can have a continuation of chats or discussions downstairs as well, and Dean will join us with that. So, welcome. So now to introduce Dean Spade. Dean is an associate professor of law at Seattle University in Washington State in the United States. Dean is also a writer and activist, specifically focusing, I think, more so on queer and trans justice issues, and has written and published a number of articles and books on the subject. I think most well known is Normal Life, and I have to look at the subtitle because I couldn't remember it. Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. Dean was also one of the co-founders of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is a non-profit law collective in New York City, offering free legal services to trans, queer, and gender diverse, primarily low-income people and also people of color. So it's fantastic. Dean is obviously very experienced in talking about trans issues, specifically trans justice issues. And today, Dean's talk is entitled, "Can We Survive Mainstreaming?" on the new visibilities and invisibilities of trans politics. So please welcome Dean Spade.
Thanks so much, Kat, for the introduction, and to Evo for amazing organizing of this event and many other events that I've been involved in this week, and also to Trans Film Fest. I'm really excited to hear what you all have been up to and the kinds of spaces and conversations you're trying to create. It's really inspiring. I'm very happy to be back in Stockholm. Nice to see some familiar faces. So this thing is happening in the U.S. that, as I understand from talking to people here, is also happening here with a kind of mainstreaming of transness, more circulating more images of trans people in the media, just a kind of conversation about trans people that's coming to the surface in ways that that are somewhat new. And in the U.S., that's happening at the same time that there's kind of a mainstreaming of conversations about criminal justice reform. So maybe people here have been following the Black Lives Matter movement or the death of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The United States has had a crisis around our extreme prison system and police violence forever, and especially in the last 40 years, there's been this drastic prison expansion. But mostly that conversation has been on the far left and among people who care about fighting racism, and suddenly there's a kind of mainstreaming of that conversation. So I'm living through this mainstreaming of these two kind of issues in politics that I really care about, and that are actually not conversations that I necessarily thought I would see mainstream in my lifetime. You kind of can't predict when something is going to mainstream. And so one of the things I've been thinking about a lot are the pitfalls of mainstreaming and the dilemmas that we face. And so I want to talk a bit about those issues, and I think they might ring with some familiar things in those movements or in other movements that you're a part of or other kind of political moments you've seen. And I think some of this might, so some of it might be familiar to the Swedish context and some of it might be very US based. And as I'm talking, I might be using concepts that are either just, are worded differently than would make sense here, or are ideas that I've developed in prior work that I'm not explaining thoroughly. So I'm so happy to get into more detail if something goes by too quickly, or if you want to understand it more later, please let me know. So I'll start with this picture, this horrible picture. So this is a picture I think kind of captures some of these dilemmas. The Seattle Police Department has created these stickers, and they want bars and restaurants and shops to put these stickers in the windows of the businesses. And the idea of the sticker is that it means this business will call the police if you come in and say that you're experiencing anti-LGBT violence. So it's this kind of it's a public relations campaign for the Seattle Police Department. The Seattle Police Department has been under investigation by the federal government for its racist killings of Black and Indigenous people. Their public image is very tarnished at this moment. There's been all this evidence that they are engaged in this extreme racist violence. And their response is to have this campaign about how progressive they are. And it's been responded to by queer and trans activists in Seattle who don't feel safe calling the police and don't believe that calling the police creates a safe space. This is one image from the kind of counter discourse that I thought I'd show. So it's an interesting moment to think about how do symbols like the rainbow flag as a symbol of LGBT movements or queer and trans resistance kind of become taken up by the very institutions that are the biggest danger to us and used to promote their interests. So this campaign does not make the Seattle Police Department like a safe place to call. It just makes a PR campaign for them. So this is the kind of dynamic I want to talk about today. So mainstreaming, I have a picture of Caitlyn Jenner. She's kind of the poster person for mainstreaming trans politics in the U.S. You know, we have our very own white Republican, conservative celebrity trans woman. So mainstreaming, you know, a few kind of key main things about it. We get new forms of visibility, right? So we start to see a trans woman on the cover of Vanity Fair. What? You know, it's a big deal. We get conditional acceptance. There's an idea that if you can capture white femininity like Caitlyn Jenner, you might be an okay trans person, which is almost nobody, right? Like, so the kind of like, you know, what kinds of trans people become acceptable in this? It's a very narrow range. I'll talk more about that. We see the deployment of deserving figures, the trans worker, the white trans student. There's a set of trans people who we see articulated as those who don't deserve to be harmed. And so we get this, and what's the kind of the subtext of that is always that there's somebody else who's not okay. But we're not those bad monsters. We're not criminals. We're not lazy. We're not, you know, all of these are like racial narratives in the U.S. or anti-immigrant narratives, anti-porn narratives, narratives that blame people with disabilities. So these are the kinds of underlying this kind of who's deserving, right? And then we get what I'm calling recuperative reform proposals. This is more what I'm going to talk about today. So when the moment of mainstreaming happens, the mainstream discovers the issue, reframes it, and then we get reform proposals that ultimately won't change the harm and violence people are facing. So the Seattle Police Department will have a sticker about you, but it doesn't change the level of violence the Seattle Police Department will be engaged in. I'll give you some more examples of that in a moment. And then sometimes something else that also happens with mainstreaming is a bunch of backlash that actually enhances the vulnerability of the targeted group. So in the United States right now, we're seeing this all this bathroom panic. I don't know how much this is being covered in the media here, but a number of states are trying to pass bills that say trans people can't use the bathroom. And then there's the federal government said that trans youth should be able to use the bathroom in their schools. And then all these states are suing the federal government to say that's not true. So we are seeing, we don't just see the stirring up of deserving images, we also see a huge backlash stir. And this has happened numerous times in queer and trans politics. In many ways, I think that the backlash that's happening right now that targets trans people's use of bathrooms isn't actually only a response to trans visibility. It's a response to the kind of broader gay and lesbian mainstream of the last 30 years. And I could explain that more. But we often see these backlashes. Another example of this is in California when, kind of the elite mainstream gay and lesbian organizations decided to sue so that same-sex marriage would be legal there. So before that, in the state of California, same-sex couples could have all the same rights and experiences as opposite-sex couples, but it wasn't called marriage, it was called domestic partnership. So it had a different name. So these organizations sued because they wanted the name to be marriage. So it was kind of a very symbolic move. And it produced a lot, and a lot of us were critical of that, of all the things to spend the resources on. There's so many queer and trans people in immigration prisons in California, in criminal punishment prisons. There's queer and trans youth who are really struggling in public schools and the child welfare system. Like, why put all of the money and energy towards this suit about what marriage is called, right? The kind of symbolic politics, there's a critique we could have there. But anyway, they did that lawsuit and they won it, and the response was Proposition 8, which was like sometimes called Prop Hate. It was a law in California that was anti-same-sex marriage. But the rhetoric that was stirred up around the campaign for Proposition 8 was like a huge amount of like homophobic and transphobic rhetoric was generated in this process. And the people who mainly experience the effects of that change in climate are the people who are the most vulnerable already. So it's queer and trans youth in the foster care system. It's queer and trans people who go to the welfare office and then the person there is hostile to them. It's those who already are the most vulnerable to being targeted or harmed. The people who benefit from marriage are people mostly who have a lot of property, who have property they want to share with each other, who have healthcare benefits they want to share with each other, who have immigration status they want to share with each other. In general, in the United States, the people who marry the most are those with the most resources. White people marry more than people of color. Rich people marry more than poor people, because marriage primarily benefits people who have something to share and protect. So those who benefited from the lawsuit were not the same people who suffered severely from the backlash. Does this make sense, right? Like, so that is an interesting piece for me. Like, the current narrative around the bathrooms in the U.S., you'll see materials, a white transgender student who can't use the bathroom in his school, but the people who are really going to be harmed and targeted in the bathroom are black transgender women using a bathroom in a public park or at a McDonald's, people who don't have housing, people who are the least fit the norms of white masculinity and white femininity, people who are the poorest and can do the least to adapt their external persona, right? So it's interesting just to think about who backlash targets. And one of the ways that deserving figures are being deployed, maybe you've seen these, I'm not sure if they're reaching here as much, these pictures people are posting on social media. They'll have a picture of a very passing, usually white transgender person, and it'll say, "Are you scared to have this person in the men's bathroom with you?" or whatever it is. And it's like, look, these deserving passing people, they should be able to use the bathroom. But it's like the problem isn't really actually for them. The problem is for all the trans people who are already targets, who are already considered suspicious in our society, which is mostly, especially people of color. So just thinking about these dynamics around how mainstreaming happens, who, if anyone, benefits from mainstreaming, and then who, if anyone, loses the most in the backlash. Anyway, so some of the kind of typical mainstream reforms that have been heavily critiqued in left kind of racial and economic justice movements in the U.S. Around queer and trans resistance, these kinds of what I would call recuperative reforms, hate crime laws, right? Laws that enhance the punishing power of the prosecutor if it's believed that you killed somebody or beat them because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. These laws have been critiqued because they don't prevent any violence against our communities at all. They don't. People don't read the law books and think, oh, what will the punishment be? Maybe I won't beat you now. It's not how violence works at all. And they tend to enhance financial money resources to police departments, which are the number one cause of violence in our communities, and they enhance the prosecution power. So they kind of build prisons and policing, but they don't actually support our lives. So it's kind of similar to the sticker campaign, except for more insidious, because it's actually expanding the power of a very harmful apparatus in our lives. Anti-discrimination measures, these have been critiqued because they don't work. It's been illegal to engage in racial discrimination, disability discrimination, gender discrimination in the United States for like half a century, and those things have not reduced from that, right? Like the racial wealth divide, the gender wealth gap, these things have expanded during the same period where supposedly racism became illegal, sexism became illegal. But what they do is they create the idea that the state is your protector against racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, when in reality the state is actually the source of the primary violences in the lives of vulnerable people. So it's a very different framing. So again, it recuperates or it rehabilitates institutions that we've actually tried to expose as violent in our lives. Anti-bullying measures in U.S. schools are just like hate crimes laws for kids. They're like, they make it easier to kick kids out of school. So usually they're used against youth of color. There's a school discipline is targeted at youth of color, at youth with disabilities, and at low-income youth. So these just become another tool for kicking kids of color out of school or making it harder for them to continue. They don't actually change the climate for queer and trans students. They're just punishment focused. They're not prevention focused. They're not about changing the whole context of the school, the whole culture of the school. Criminalization of domestic violence. There's a large literature about this, about the ways in which focusing on making high criminal penalties for domestic violence and sexual assault hasn't 40 years of that hasn't reduced those things. It has just increased the role of police in the lives of poor people and people of color. And often it's resulted actually in the same people who are experiencing domestic violence being more likely to be arrested. So things like mandatory arrest laws where the police have to arrest somebody if there's a domestic violence call. Often they arrest the person who's experiencing domestic violence, right? Because that's the power dynamics in the situation make it hard for the police to tell, or they just arrest everybody is very common. So there's very strong in trans communities. There's been a lot of experiences of, supposedly the police will protect you if you're experiencing domestic violence, but when the police come, they beat trans people, they arrest trans people spend a lot of time in jail and prison. So the concern, again, that we have an important set of feminist movements that exposed domestic violence and sexual assault as severe problems in our lives And the answer was, let's expand criminal punishment system, which is not an ally to women or to people experiencing gender violence. So we see a failed solution. It didn't resolve the problem, but it did expand the harm, actually. Another kind of classic example, let's hire trans police, right? That one should be easy to understand, this problem, right? So in the United States, it used to be, what police violence used to look like was white police in communities of color arresting, killing, beating, exploiting. And so in the last 40 years, now we have police departments hire people who look like you to do the same thing. It's the same system. The bosses are usually white people, right? So to have trans cops or to have women cops or to have cops of color, it doesn't change the iteration of the system. It's a kind of classic, tokenizing move. Another example, current debate in the United States about legalizing trans military service, right? So again, the idea that the military in the United States in the last 15 years last like 6 years has really re-articulated itself and said, oh no, we're going to let lesbian and gay people serve. We're going to let women serve in combat. So the U.S. military is now a site of gender liberation, right? Now you laugh. This is a joke, right? So, of course, we know that the reality is that is happening at the same time. There's been extreme amounts of exposés about the level of sexual violence within the military. So people in the military experiencing extremely high levels of sexual violence, lots of corruption around trying to even investigate that. There's been lots of exposés around that. Not to mention that the U.S. military, everywhere in the world that it operates, is a source of sexual violence, right? In those spaces, we've lots of discussions about Okinawa in the news right now. Not to mention just that the United States military is like the largest source of violence in the world. So the idea of kind of recuperating or rehabilitating this institution to say it's gay friendly, it's women friendly or trans friendly, right? So problematic mainstream reforms. So pitfalls of reforms, just as summary. One concern is that we don't want reforms that don't provide any material relief for people, right? Like the point of our movements is to actually save our lives, right? To reduce the harm and violence people experience. So the move towards having reforms, especially reforms that say, oh, our organization won a law, but if the law isn't doing anything to change, this kind of false victories, right? The concern about false victories. Or relief that only reaches the least marginalized. This is sometimes called creaming. You know how when you have like a cup of milk and the cream rises to the top? The idea that you would only have help for those who are the least marginalized of the marginalized group. So most people don't see a change, but maybe the richest or the whitest or the ones with that immigration status, those few people can access this, whatever this reform is. The concern that it provides window dressing or just a new cover for a harmful system or institution, or that it actually just tinkers with that system but doesn't reach the root causes of the harm in our communities, or that it expands that system, right? So hate crimes laws, expanding the number of things that you could be prosecuted for, or giving more money to the police, or hiring more cops, right? That anything that in our name expands something that we're actually trying to reduce or dismantle. And the concern that it divides people into deserving and undeserving, so that we get the passing white trans person deserves a safe place to go to the bathroom, but homeless trans people no, they're still suspicious. They shouldn't, we don't want them here, right? Or that in the United States, the narrative, the discussions about migrant justice are very burdened with this deserving, undeserving. It's kind of, President Obama says in response to the migrant justice movement, he says, yes, we're going to target the bad immigrants, but we're going to let a few of the good immigrants in. And so he says, we want families to stay, but we want felons, people who have felony criminal records, to go. And so he's going to, his reforms will create a tiny, 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 tiny pathway for a few people to have deferred deportation. It's not like they have status, just deferred deportation. Meanwhile, he expands money to the border wall and to the enforcement of the border, and more ways of targeting people who have experienced contact with the criminal system. And if you look at all the immigrants in the United States, the people who are most likely to have experienced contact with the criminal system are the poorest people, people with darker skin, right? All the people who are already targeted by the police, right? More police in their neighborhoods, more likely to have had that contact. So it creates this kind of, the deserving group and the undeserving group also often operates along the lines of class or race or gender or disability, all the things that we would expect. So we're concerned about reforms that kind of divide up our communities in that way, and make the most vulnerable even more vulnerable. I thought this comment kind of captures the pitfalls of reform. It's horrible. And this is an image that I worked with an artist to create, that we were trying to talk about how frequently when we talk about trans people in prisons in the U.S., people say, oh, well, maybe there should be a trans prison. Maybe then they wouldn't get hurt all the time. They wouldn't be in so much danger. So this is, this dilemma about, we don't want trans prisons. We want no trans people in prison, no people in prison, right? This was drawn by Talcott Broadhead. So the question that I come to is, like, how do we tell if a particular reform is recuperative, right? This is actually a really hard question. Like, first we have to get through all that other stuff where we can even critique reforms and where we can say, like, it's not a big win just because they wrote our name in some law, right? Or, you know what I mean? We have to first get there, which means a lot of letting go. I was recognized by the state, what a relief. So first we have to get to the place where we ask, like, what's really happening here, right? But then we get to this really hard question. In the past, some of the criteria I've used are these. Does it provide material relief? Not surprising from what I already said. Does it leave out an especially marginalized part of the affected group? So it's like, this will work, but not for people who have a criminal record, or not for people who don't have immigration status, right? Like, kind of, those are two typical leave-out groups when people are looking at reforms, but there's many other ways we could think about that. People, in trans reform, sometimes it's yes, but only for people who have had access to these medical procedures, or only for people who have had access to these legal channels, right? So that's the kind of typical one. Does it legitimize or expand a system we're trying to dismantle? Right, that's a good question to ask. And one of the other questions I often ask is, does it mobilize the most effective for ongoing struggle? So sometimes short-term reform efforts, one of the things they can do is build power for a longer struggle. So we would still want to ask the other questions. Like, we don't want it to be making us move backwards. But an example of this is in New York City, so New York City has the welfare authority is called the Human Resources Administration. And it's a terrible part of the government that does tons of horrible things to poor people, and the entire benefit system is deeply unfair and deeply racist and very difficult for people with disabilities. And the benefits are like, you can't live off of them. It's very punitive. It's terrible. And inside that system, there's particular harms trans people face. Like, there's all kinds of ways that it's very hard for trans people to get benefits, and they get discriminated against in the different offices they have to go to, and they get told that they aren't work ready because their appearance isn't professional because it's the wrong gender, and I mean, just all these things, right, that happen. And so there was, around 2006, there was a bunch of us who were trying to get a set of policies passed through the Human Resources Administration that we thought might help reduce some of those barriers to trans people accessing benefits. Our goal was number one, to provide immediate material relief. And so we thought it worked effectively for the other two pieces as well. And alongside that, so we created a kind of best practices document that was what we wanted most, and the Human Resources Administration was not interested in doing it. They just were going to not touch it, And then a group of Black trans women primarily, who are all people who are currently on welfare benefits, so the poorest trans people in New York City, basically, and mostly Black trans women, they were doing an organizing project to try to push the Human Resources Administration to make these changes. And that organizing project was really amazing. People built a lot of skills. People learned how to be public speakers. They learned how to work together to facilitate meetings. They learned about working with the media. They taught each other all these organizing skills. They worked deeply in alliance with other organizations that before that hadn't cared about their issues. They brought these issues into the agendas of other economic justice organizations, other queer and trans organizations, and also a lot of new leaders were built out of this process. Leaders from extremely hated groups. So that was very amazing. These new leaders emerged, and this new analysis emerged along a lot of people from having seen what these women were doing. And what they won was a very minimal change that wasn't that helpful. And they created a palm card that they would give out among people in their own community, like, these are your rights when you go to the HRA. And they knew that the people at the HRA office were not going to follow it. And they knew that it was limited and that HRA is still terrible and designed to kill poor people. Everyone knew that. There was no illusion that it had solved all the problems. But the whole entire process produced significant political power for a very, very marginalized group. And that set of people went on to be, some of them became leaders in the Occupy Wall Street movement when that happened, and some of them were really strong leaders in the movement against the stop and frisk policing in New York City that really determined the next mayoral election. And there was a lot of really meaningful things that happened. So one of the pieces I'm trying to capture in this bullet is just that we care about the content of reform, and we also care about the processes. Who was mobilized? How did that change politics generally? So these things are all kind of being thinking about them together. So I've been trying to think, this semester I've been teaching my law and social movements class again, and I've been thinking about I've been noticing as I read different, especially scholar activists, like people who are not in academia but who write books about politics, how do they evaluate reforms? Like, what are those are my criteria that I just showed you, but what are some other ones that I could get inspired by? So I was reading Peter Gelderloos. He's like a American anarchist writer. He wrote a book called How Nonviolence Protects the State. That's a critique of passivism. It's a really useful, interesting book. And he recently updated it in a book called The Failure of Nonviolence. In the new book, he kind of looks at a bunch of different kind of like revolutionary moments in the world in the last 10 years and just evaluates whether he thinks they're liberatory based on his criteria. I don't agree with everything he says, but his criteria was so interesting to me as a way to think about some of these questions in some ways that were different from mine, or that it would maybe expand my thinking. So one was, he asks, does it seize space in which new social relations can be enacted? In some ways, he's thinking literally about the seizure of space, so he's looking at movements that take the public square. He's looking at the M15 movement in Spain, or he's looking at, the landless people's movement in Brazil. He's looking at movements that take space, and also in those spaces enact new social relations, like people feeding each other, or people making decisions together horizontally. Like in the United States, one of the things that was really interesting about the Occupy movement was that most people who live in the United States have never been to any meeting or any place where a decision was made where there wasn't a boss, teacher, parent, somebody else is going to tell you what's going to happen. Most people have never even thought about what it would be like to make decisions with people without there being some upper person. So even for all of its limitations and all these different Occupy encampments all over the country, people were trying to make decisions horizontally, outdoors, where anybody could come up and join the assembly and say what they think and try to come to consensus. This was very transformative for many people. It produced a lot of changes in the activism that followed, and a lot more people thinking about power differently in decision making. So, seizing space in which new social relations can be enacted, I think for Gelderloos means a lot of different things. But it's like, did we try doing stuff that you're not supposed to do? And what happened? How did that change us? I think it's an interesting question about what's liberatory. He also wants to know, did it spread awareness of its ideas? He doesn't mean like, did I see something about it on Twitter? He means, it's not, have I heard of it, but like, did people then start a Black Lives Matter chapter in their own town? Did people take the ideas and then enact them in their own ways, in their own spaces, right? So this is an interesting criteria as well. He also asks, does it have elite support? In Gelderloos's view, if it has elite support, it's likely to be a false victory. I think that is very, very interesting. Really complicated in a place like Sweden where you have state feminism and stuff. I don't know how we're going to talk about that. But I think it's an interesting question, right? Like, he says the elite will usually support things that are not terribly disruptive to them. There's an idea that I often use from critical race theory that's called preservation through transformation. The idea is that whenever possible, when there's social movements that are raising concerns, pushing back, the legal system will transform just enough to preserve the status quo. So just enough change to make it look like something's changed, but mostly things are the same, especially for elites. So Gelderloos, I think, in another way helps us ask, are elites supporting this because it's like the least disruptive to them of the things that could happen? So one way, like you saw this in the United States over the last 20 years, where neoliberal politicians would come out in favor of same-sex marriage. These are the same politicians who are doing attacks on poor people in their cities, attacks on migrants, all of these, increasing criminalization of poverty. But then they're fine with same-sex marriage because same-sex marriage is not at odds with those policies. It's about whether or not two wealthy people or two people can share things they have. It doesn't require any more state support. It doesn't change anything about the immigration system, the criminal system. So it was a comfortable way for them to appear progressive. I mean, did you see this with Obama's second term? He became interested in gay politics in the second term. Hillary Clinton made her famous speech about how gay rights are human rights, which was kind of her signal that we are going to now use homophobia as a justification for U.S. military imperialism. So if your country seems homophobic, we're going to bomb you or take over, right? In the same way that they've already used accusations of sexism that way forever. You see this kind of what people call pinkwashing, right? The idea that politicians, institutions, figures that are actually quite bent on their evil, people-killing things, wrap it all in a big rainbow flag or a women's symbol, and then everyone's like, yeah, that's a cool person. That military is really great. They let gay people serve, And then he asked, does it achieve any concrete gains that improve people's lives? So similar to my material support question. I also looked at Harsha Walia. She wrote a book that I really recommend called Undoing Border Imperialism. She's also a scholar who's not in academia. She's part of the No One is Illegal movement in Canada, which has chapters in many different cities, and they do a lot of direct action to stop deportations, and they do a lot of work around, their broader frame is a Indigenous solidarity frame. So they use the idea, no one is illegal, Canada is illegal. So challenging Canada's occupation in North America and challenging Canadian colonialism and supporting migrant justice. A very interesting group. Her book really outlines a lot of their tactics and strategies and a lot of the hard questions they ask. I really recommend it, the whole thing. It's awesome. One of the things she says is, has the tactic been effective in exposing or confronting a specific point within the system by either diminishing its moral legitimacy or undermining its functions? When I read this quote, I think about, in 2008, No One is Illegal extensively organized around the deportation of a man named Laibar Singh. And they turned out 2,000 people who closed the international terminal of the Vancouver airport and stopped his deportation. This has never happened in the United States that I'm aware of. We block deportation buses leaving immigration prisons. There are direct actions, but they literally closed the international wing of the airport and stopped his deportation. You can watch the video of it on YouTube. It is unbelievable. I get chills every time I talk about it. So they're both stopping the functioning of the system, and they're doing so much work to undermine its moral legitimacy. So they won't stand, they won't ask politicians to stand and hold hands with them and say, we're going to fight for a better immigration system. They won't legitimize the system through a story about tinkering. And even their name, No One is Illegal, refuses a lesser reform, right? Which is a very bold position that I think has changed the conversation in Canadian politics about migration. Critical Resistance, it's been for the last 20 years the leading prison abolition organization in the United States. If you all want to talk more about what prison abolition is and what those theories are, I'm really happy to do that. But one of the things they ask is, they say, we reject reforms that reorient and prolong the life of the prison industrial complex. So they don't want anything that's going to prolong imprisonment or any of the things that produce imprisonment. They ask, will it expand the system we're trying to dismantle? And this has been really useful to me. We have to undo this later. For the last 20 years, talking to people in this organization has really influenced my thinking. They don't want, when people in prison system are having, they have extreme medical neglect, right? People in prison are not given proper medicine in the United States. There's lots of early death, extreme suffering. We want to fight against that. They don't want to hire more doctors. They want to get people out of prison, right? There's two very different frameworks. So they're looking to avoid anything that actually expands the system in the name of making it good. They don't believe that the prison system can ever be safe or just. And so anything that expands it or tries to make it better, they're like, let's get people out, let's make it smaller. Let's get people out, let's make it smaller. Let's get, that's stop there. So they oppose prison building projects. They oppose prison expansion projects. They work towards decriminalization of anything they can, right? Anything that gets people out, they work towards compassionate medical release or other things that will move people out, right? So it's a strategy question because, of course, there's the prison system in the United States, its entire history of growth is a history of reform. Every time they build a new prison, they say it's for the prisoners, right? They say, oh, the prison is too crowded or it's dirty, it's bad. We need to build a new one that's bigger. Or we need to build another one. So they always say it's in the name of the prisoners, right? So to say, no, we will not, we are going to see that logic and have a set of reform evaluations that oppose that. I'll also add this woman, Miriam Kaba. She's a Chicago-based anti-police violence activist. I just think she wrote this article that was about how do we evaluate police reforms because of the mainstreaming of criminal justice that's happening now. And she said, we asked, does it allocate more money to the police? Does it advocate for more policing or policing, right? Let's have women police, let's have trans police, whatever. Is the reform primarily technology focused? This is very interesting because right after the riots in Ferguson were happening and all of that resistance started after Mike Brown's death and the verdict, the first thing Obama said was, let's have body cameras on police, right? So it's a technology focus. All the evidence shows that the body camera footage is actually used against defendants. It's used against people being policed. It's not used against the police, right? And also, there's a whole industry of there's like a weapons industry that makes less lethal policing weapons. They make tasers, that shock you. They make ankle monitoring so that you can have somebody be in jail but at their house. They make and they make body cameras. So the stock of those shoots up, right? So we're thinking broadly about the fact that Miriam Kaba says technology will never solve policing, right? The origins of policing in the United States are white supremacy. Policing is a racial project. Policing is an anti-poor project. Policing is a sexist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist project. It cannot be resolved through any form of technology. So this is a very, I think, interesting, critical, specific move she's making. And she asks, is it focused on individual dialogues with individual cops? All the kind of liberal stories, if only they knew, if we could change their minds, right? As long as you have people working as police, they will look for suspicious people. And they will harm them and kidnap them and put them in cells. This kind of liberal framework of education is a real danger to actually transforming, right? She wants there just to be less cops, not cops who've had a 5-minute training about who transgender people are or whatever. There's a lot of the point for me, like thinking about these other people's criteria is just how can we get to interesting conversations about reforms? Because we don't know. Some reforms are easy to knock down. Hate crime laws are just a really bad idea. But some things are really complicated. And I want us to be in movements where we actually have the hard conversations about whether or not a reform will work and where we can actually debate it, because we often don't know. Or something worked here and then there was a counter move from the institutions that are harming us and then now it doesn't work anymore. Actually have that conversation, right? Which is very, very hard to have in the United States. People cannot read propaganda, right? They just believe that the police department says it's gay friendly. They believe it's gay friendly. You know what I mean? We're in a moment where we've been stripped of a lot of our critical capacities, especially those in power. The elites have the least capacity to read this because they're not the ones targeted by the police, right? So there's part of this is a divide in queer and trans politics in the United States between a racial and economic justice centered queer and trans politics and kind of the mainstreamed queer and trans politics. But so part of it for me is, can we let go of the idea that we win because a court said something about us or whatever, and instead really ask these hard questions? And then we might debate other reforms. I just made a random list here of things that are related to trans politics. One thing is, obviously I believe we should decriminalize stuff. Our communities are push towards criminal punishment, and a lot of people that results in deportation. So how can we just get rid of criminalization of things? And I've been saying that for years, like everybody else, of course. But then what's hard is what happens next. I live in Washington State. In Washington State, they've decriminalized recreational marijuana use. And what's happening is that the entire recreational marijuana industry is owned by white people. That's who's making money off of it. They're using recreational marijuana businesses are being used to gentrify poor and black neighborhoods, and black people are still being criminalized for marijuana. So decriminalization is very important. Don't think we should undo that, but the things that happen afterwards may mean the markets forces that are in place, the regimes that are being created may actually mean that the results don't change sufficiently. So how do we be ready for that complexity? And I've heard the same things about various jurisdictions in which there's legalized prostitution, where oftentimes, even though we've decriminalized, there's been a decriminalization of sex work, which is very important and vital for our communities, it has not always resulted in reduced criminalization of the most vulnerable sex workers often still being targeted. So that's how do we figure out what's going to, these are the much harder conversations about implementation, about what we fight for along the way, how we sharpen our demands around these regimes as if we win any kind of decriminalization. Another example of this is, if we know the police are terrible, should we have civilian review boards? This is like a reform that's commonly discussed in the United States, but many civilian review boards don't have any power to fire police or to investigate police. Kind of what's really going to happen? Is it just another kind of like cover? We created a committee of people like you, a committee where nothing can happen, right? There's a million versions of that in government. A big question in the United States is queer and trans units in jails and prisons. For many years, many jails and prisons had like men's jails and prisons would have a place where they would put gay men and trans women. And in some prisons and jails, that was an extremely dangerous place to be, like a place with much more violence. And in some, it was a place that was maybe somewhat safer, and it really varied. And some of them still have them, some of them are getting rid of them, some of them are building them. So this is like a very hard question for us because people experience very different things in these units. In general, the people I've been working with for about 15 years doing work around trans people's experiences in prison and queer experiences in prison, our belief is that we should not have like a single standard reform because, that's what people always ask for. What's the one thing that should happen in prisons that will make people safer? And the problem is that when you speak to all these people in all these different prisons and jails around the country, they're experiencing different results of these policies and frameworks depending on their identities, depending on how, the shape of that particular facility. So our answer is, of course, let them out, right? That's the only policy that can actually solve the violence trans queer people face in prison, right? But that is, so, there's always this pressure to tinker with the prison. But this is a very hard question because people really differ, location to location about this. So this is an important debate for us to have. Also, another kind of thing that emerges is reforms that funnel people into other systems. So the idea that, people shouldn't go to prison, they should go to psychiatric hospital. They shouldn't go to prison, they should go to halfway house, or there's often a kind of move to have reforms that like put people somewhere else, but those places are also sites of the same kinds of violence and regulation, but it's considered softer or something. So that's another piece where we have to have like a very sharp, constant, complicated conversation. And then more broadly, proposals for softer punishment. Seattle, where I live in Seattle, it's like the city markets itself as a social justice city. It's just like all the other expensive big cities, the same policing tactics, same anti-poor stuff, but it tells the world we are the progressive city of the United States or something. And one of the things it promotes is its diversion programs. So there's some programs where if you get arrested in Seattle, instead of going straight to jail, you go to like these classes, or you go there. A lot of these things. If you fail at something, you go back to jail. Like if you then you have a positive drug test, then you still go back to jail. But there's some kind of diversion. The idea being that like, yes, you got arrested, but you went this way instead of to jail or prison. The real question is, why did you get arrested, right? The same people keep getting arrested. So, in the United States, white people do way more drugs than people of color, but people of color go to jail for drugs, right? Like that's like why are certain people getting arrested is the actual question, not what happens to you afterwards. Any program that only deals with the secondary effects is going to, the trauma people experience of being arrested, especially young people, it's especially people and also people with mental health experiences. The idea of being kidnapped and put into a car and taken somewhere by the police is extremely traumatic. So we need to, kind of come earlier at this. But the Seattle is like, we're amazing, we're wonderful, give us more grants for our diversion programs. It is kind of, we're going to build the system through these softer technologies. Another example of this is like special courts. So they have drug court or mental health court or prostitution court. These, the idea of these courts that are for people with these special problems that'll be like softer, but in the end, the results are often that the same people are put under like long-term state surveillance and end up back in the regular criminal system. So there's a lot of these reforms that are about kind of softening, but they don't actually remove state surveillance from the same targeted groups. And the last one I'll say is data collection. I just think I get frustrated. There's a pretty strong narrative in the U.S. If we only knew more about trans people, if we only wrote questions about them on the census or on the, or sometimes lesbian gay people too. And I have several concerns about this. One is like, who is asking these questions? Who is writing these questions? Who are they counting as trans? I mean, a lot of the data collection about lesbian and gay people in the last 10 years has focused on people who are in same-sex marriage-like relationships. So if you're not in that relationship, you're not counted. Like, that definition of who is queer is so dangerous for our actual communities, right? And oftentimes surveys that count trans people will only count people with particular medical experiences or particular identities or particular words. So I'm interested in being cautious about that. It's usually elites controlling that type of thing. And the other piece that I'm concerned about is, it's based on an idea that if they only knew who we were, then they would not hurt us. It's not true, right? Like, we are in an antagonistic relationship with institutions that operate through certain kinds of racialized gender norms, and we know what's happening in our communities, and I think there are very meaningful ways that we collect data about that in our own communities, but I'm just very suspicious of this kind of like constant unreflective turn to please count us, right? I think it's a dangerous road for us. I'm not anti all data collection, obviously we all find out about stuff, but I'm concerned about the kind of assumption that this would solve our problems. So, and I just want to finish with this, is an image made by a trans artist, Chris Vargas, about kind of an anti-recuperation approach to military service. I think I have some other images here. He says, don't ask to fight their wars, don't tell them that's what we're for. Oh, and there's just some other, images of queer and trans resistance that feel like something different than that. So that's it. I would love to discuss these ideas with you all. Maybe we can just have we talked about having like 1 or 2 questions and then a break and then the panel. So maybe people have any pressing or anything you want clarified too if something didn't make good sense.
Sorry, we're just having technical issues. Apparently there's a buzzing sound on the live stream which obviously isn't here. So, oh, is it? Okay. So it's there as well. Well, we're going to take a break in a couple of minutes and we'll try and sort out the buzzing sound. But thank you very much indeed, Dean, for a very interesting and... There's plenty to get our teeth stuck into in that sense with that. Is there anyone that has any questions or comments that they want to make? We just have to then use the microphone. So if you could raise your hand, please. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sigrid. I have a question actually regarding Sweden's role in this kind of processes. Because, for example, Sweden is not a member of NATO, but still we have a NATO Center of Excellence for Gender in Military Operations, which is not like, it's not common knowledge, but Sweden is actually NATO's expert in implementing gender in military operations. And we also have a lot of processes regarding like the Sweden trying to promote the picture of itself being like the champion of human rights, which goes like seamlessly together with this center, for example. And my question is, how are you in like an American context? Are you talking about Sweden? Are you having some kind of discussion about this? Because as a Swede, I can see. Also, I'm a former first lieutenant from the Swedish Army, and I've been working abroad as well. And I can see like this picture of Sweden is really used, for example, by the American Armed Forces. So that was my question. Are you discussing Sweden in the US and how?
That's a great question. I think you're completely right. So the image one of the reasons I really like coming to Sweden and talking to Swedish activists and learning more about the struggle here is because in the United States, Sweden is the left utopia, which is really, so to me, when it's easy to be like, oh, the United States is so fucked up, it's so racist, this huge prison system, it's really obvious, right? Like, it's like so ridiculous. The extreme wealth divide. And Sweden has a social welfare state that many people in the United States wish we could have, and and so what's hidden there, right, is the actual racism and xenophobia in Sweden, the actual cost of a social welfare state that seeks to standardize the population and produce subjects who are homogenized, right? So we see this in the history of trans treatment in Sweden, sterilization history in Sweden. So to me, what I've been interested in since I first came here in 2008 is like, what can we learn about the state itself by looking at Sweden and the United States, which appear so different? And also, how can we kind of pop these left fantasies in the United States about the other wealthy countries that have these broader social welfare states, and so that we could say, like, how could you have a racist state project that supports people's health care and one that doesn't support people's health care? How could you have a racist state project that has prisons that look like this or prisons that look like this? That it's not only one thing, right? And so that I think this could make a more sophisticated account for me in the U.S. with my friends on the left about not kind of falling into this false fantasy. And I did not know about this Native Center as such a good example, right? It's almost as, I think that this is a broad problem globally, the idea that the way to manufacture consent now is to make whatever your racist state project is appear progressive, and gender and sexuality are two key like masks for that, and that's happening in so many places in so many ways. And maybe I think the history of Sweden's state feminism is a very deep lesson for places like the United States that have not had that state feminism, or it's only kind of a little bit there with the Obama administration, and now increasingly. So I really thank you for sharing that further example. Yeah.
Because I know that when Obama visited Sweden, he mentioned the center like this is the biggest thing between U.S. and Sweden.
Wow.
This is our biggest cooperation. This is most important. So basically, the Swedish state feminism is like in the center of U.S. imperialism right now, as I view it. And we're not really discussing like this is a super sexist and racist country. I think a lot of people can acquaintance that, but it's like two levels. Like living as a Swede with relative privilege, as I do, it's okay. But if you're not counted as a Swede, it's not the same way. And also, this like white state feminism is perfect for militarization worldwide. And I don't think it's. I don't know. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments, and then we will take a break. So, anyone feeling inspired? Obviously, we'll be coming back, and you can take a little break now, maybe then, and come back. I think at 3:10. So we'll be starting at 3:10. So toilets and cafes downstairs. So thank you very much, and thank you, Dean.
do that.
So that's it on now.
The same and different. Yeah, I think one of the crazy things about the, like I said about the bathroom girls, is that that rhetoric is coming about here. So, and how can, and there's always
Okay, testing again. Okay.
in this context, especially in Sweden, where you have to sort of do a different
Testing. It's okay. It's all right. Okay.
Testing. Okay.
Well, you got the Swedish, the interesting about the sex work.
Testing. Okay.
Which we're trying, which is being exported around I think that's something to sort of.
Yeah, hello, testing. Does it work? Yes, I think so.
Do you want me to test this?
Yes, please.
Hello. Oh, it works. Yeah, is that okay? Sweet.
That was very camp of me, wasn't it? Oh, hello, it works.
So then,
We're still with the.
I think this is. I think we. Well, we can follow on.
I can also say that when I ask you about the work that you're doing, you can also say that if you want, you can connect it.
All right. If you incorporate who we are with that question,
Can I move this around?
yeah. And also this one here.
Yeah, that's what I first thought, and then Micah thought that I should first ask you. Maybe you can actually, we can just.
you can ask Mike.
I could just
Thanks,
ask
Alex.
you. If you can introduce yourself, say something about what
Maybe
you're doing.
you move over. That one. You
relate.
can just move that one over, and then I'll put this one.
Maybe start with that. I'll also have to dash it forward downstairs to pick up my car.
So Micah and Dean.
Yeah,
We're not going to go on. We have to be out. Yeah. What are we doing?
Dean's glass. Is that Dean's?
Where's Dean? No, that's Micah. So Dean over here. This is you.
It's Dean's existing glass.
Dean first.
Oh no.
No, they're on you.
Maybe say that to Yolanda, that I will just start asking you, introducing yourself, the work you're doing, and who you are, and if you want.
Related to the talk.
Thanks.
Here, I'll send it.
All right. Our feet are visible.
So if maybe we can start getting comfy again for the next session. As we mentioned earlier, this is the opportunity for engagement and questions and comments, so you're very welcome to do so. So over to you, Ivo. Thank you.
Yes, welcome back in the room. On the panel, we have Yolanda Aurora Bom, we have Michael Drinovic, we have Josephine Krieg, and we have Dean Spade on the stage here again. The aim with this panel is to discuss problems related to Dean's talk, but also to connect these problems and questions to the geographical and geopolitical context that we find ourselves situated within, which we also started to address before the break. And with our context, I mean our, which might of course mean contexts in plural, depending on different migrations and movements that we have been doing. When we here have talked for about 30 minutes, I think it will be now, because we are a bit short of time, we will open up for a bigger discussion with the audience. And I think that you can also contribute to the discussion, so we look forward to that as well. Yes, I will very shortly say a little bit about myself. Kat said something. I can say that maybe my main activist work right now is contributing to making a space for transgender studies in the Swedish Academy, and I'm also doing some other things. Yeah, so maybe you can start with, you will introduce yourself and say a little bit about the work that you're doing, what you have achieved maybe in your work, and if you want, you can also relate it to the problems of Dean's talk. You can start with Yolanda.
Hi, pressure is on. Hi, my name is Yolanda Aurora Boom, not bomb, but boom, like an explosion kind of, you know. So I'm one of the vice presidents of, hi, welcome. I'm one of the vice presidents for RFSL Ungdom, the youth organization for LGBTQI youth here in Sweden. The I is, we just recently started working more with the I letter. As I'm also a poet and a spoken word artist. So the things we've been working with lately have been mostly in regards to like the trans healthcare and trying to make it more inclusive and more like available to everybody. And now the question is more about like trying to make it like giving more finance, making it less binary, making it more so like it applies to everybody and not just to people conforming to like Eurocentric binary norms kind of. And we're also in like talks with the cops right now about how to best implement like hate crime laws and the other thingy that I don't know what's called in English. Sorry, but to make like to not make it like hitting other groups in society too. So that's kind of what we're doing right now.
I'm waiting for the floor. My name is Majka Grzywnovich and I work as International Advocacy Advisor at RFSL, the Swedish Federation for LGBTQ Rights. And my primary focus is on the UN system and ensuring that LGBTQ issues and sexual orientation, gender identity are visible there, included in different documents and policies, and my focus is also on, or has been on, legal gender recognition and looking at trans youth and access to services.
Cool. My name is Josephine Krieg. I'll welcome whoever comes through the door. It seems to be the thing we're doing. Hello. I'm a bit of an odd one. I'm sort of an independent activist, scholar, performer, cultural person, trying to be many different things at different times. It's I've worked with many different organizations here in Sweden, but also in the UK as a sort of a speaker and activist, but I've also worked a great deal in trying to create cultural space. So very excited to be working with Trans Fest Stockholm, for example. We worked very hard on the Trans Fest. I wasn't part of the film festival, but I hope to be in the future. I've run clubs that are this small and worked with organizations that are this big and published articles on different things. My main interests sort of obviously to do with trans and gender, but I have a really keen interest in rhetorical politics, cultural migration of concepts and ideas, and specifically working with intersectionality to deal with really complex problems. So mainstreaming these issues that you've brought up, specifically how policy and even activism itself can create discord and unintended and even intentional consequences that are really problematic across identities and boundaries, that if we were to try and work more collectively, obviously more complex, could actually be resolved with those issues. So I'm really keen to talk about the migration of those concepts and rhetorics and how to respond to them in a broader context to hopefully resolve those issues. And also, I'm funny on the internet sometimes.
Yeah, thank you. I think that we have a quite diverse panel, and I think it can lead to an interesting discussion about the situation that we are in and how we can work with it concretely. I will ask one question to all of you that I think can lead us in many directions. And the question is, how can we work in relation to the political situation that we see in Sweden and Europe, and also in the larger world, I think about increasing nationalism, racism, anti-refugee and anti-migrant politics. What does the political climate mean for queer, trans and feminist politics? And does the political climate influence the way in which you work in different ways? And the one who wants to start I'm looking at you to see if it...
Can you say something to start off? I think that what we see is like a stricter policing of bodies. Like if you take, for example, like the code of conduct for the subway we have here in Stockholm now, like they don't want like beggars to beg in the subway, so they like forbid you can't lie down, you can't sell papers, you can't do that, which means like the police will be looking more at specific types of people doing specific types of things, right? And then we had like the REVA, like the thing with like the internal border checks, you know, like trying to expose people from the country and all those kinds of things. And I think that everything like adds up to more policing of more bodies, and then we'll all be sucked up into it, none depending on if we're like white or trans or not white, non-white I mean, or trans or whatever.
Yeah. Someone who wants to add into that?
No, I mean, we were talking about this before. It's this idea of, the policing of the specific other. And, you know, the ideas that there's so many rhetorical concepts that are appearing in sort of politics at the moment. If you look at the UK, we have this insane Brexit thing, which just sounds like a cereal or something, but they're trying to decide whether or not to remain in the EU. It has very little to do with actual debate and all to do with this rhetorical fear of the other, whether you're on the side of staying in Europe or outside of Europe. It's usually about trying to police who can or cannot be within a certain space and how they are defined. You know, the same thing here. You know, the politics of the oh god, I've forgotten their name. The Swedish Democrats. You know, this idea of like trying to determine again who is or is not Swedish. You know, the laws of toilets in the US is another one of these concepts of who is or is not out of a certain box. And it's these concepts that are really, really terrifying. What I find really interesting is how certain concepts and ideas are being used to sort of challenge and debate those other ones. You mentioned how like sexism is used in a sort of army movements to determine whether or not you're going to invade someone. You know, here it's a rhetoric about sort of LGBT rights in certain communities. Like, well, if you let these foreigners in, they don't have LGBT rights. So you see, we care about you. I mean, you didn't think we cared about you because, you know, we weren't. But now we do, and we're going to use those ideas to sort of police your idea of who's foreign and who's not. And it's those rhetorics that I find absolutely terrifying and how they're sort of communicated. And I think that's sort of a conversation that's sometimes difficult to have in Sweden, and I can go into that later, but that's my thought on it immediately.
I think that we can definitely see that the critique is relevant for our context, but how do we work with it in practice? What do we do? Maybe Micah, do you want to start?
Just from the UN bubble, it's quite a weird animal if you look at it. It's a very structured, it's old school institution which has specific rules, who can come in and who can take space and have their voices heard. So what we can see nowadays happening is that there's a huge polarization of opinions, let's call it like this. There is extreme positive voice towards trans or intersex or LGBT in general issues, but then on the other hand it's a very, very outspoken, hardcore resistance to what we're trying to achieve. And what the answer is from that extreme negative side is bringing up the family. What the family is, how we should define family. And so every time we try to bring up LGBTQ rights, let's call it like this for now, the answer is who can be seen as the family. So then obviously there is a lot of issues with that.
So you feel that they still have to sort of fit into those those rhetorics that exist. You can't form a new rhetoric. You have to fit into the...
What we're trying to do is to have recognition of diverse forms of families. So it's not only about LGBTQ families, trans families, it's also about single parent families. You know, people nowadays create their families in different ways. But what we are unable to do for now is to have, those few little words inserted in those documents. It's a very nerdy job that I'm doing, so I'm also very often talking about words and fighting for this one word here and that one word there, but in the end.
But it sounds like the question of inclusion and exclusion is very concrete in the work that you do, also the problem of how to deal with it. I don't know if some of the others want to comment on.
I mean, for me, it was this notion of visibility that you spoke about, but we also spoke about when we were discussing this. This notion of you want to include people in legislation, rhetoric, politics, because, it feels good to be there, it's representative. And one of the things that I noticed in the politics of trans over the decade or two that I've been involved in it is this concept of visibility has been so key. We've talked so much about how important it is to be visible, that nothing will get done if we're not visible, whether it be in media, whether it be in policy, whether it be in social services, whether any of those things. If we're not visible, we can't be counted, we can't be included. But what is really interesting is what does that visibility actually allow? Who does it include and exclude? And specifically this notion of a backlash, which we are seeing quite visibly in some regards now. That inclusion and visibility is so crucial because it has been the formation of so many important movements and legislations that have had some positive impact in Europe especially, but at the same time, how do we respond to that negative backlash and the people it doesn't include? I guess that's my answer and my question. My thoughts is it has to be multiple. It has to happen on all these levels. I think it's why it's so great to have a panel of such different experience.
Do we have some activism in the Swedish context that addresses these questions on the sort of micro level? Maybe Yolanda knows something.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens too when we try to achieve the visibility is that we also put a lot of shame on people who don't want to be visible, like people who want to live in stealth or don't have a choice but to live in stealth. We kind of tell them that, oh my God, you should be visible, you should be counted, so that we can make a fight out of your life, even though people might not want it. But also, I forgot to say earlier that I work for the national television, SVT. Shout out SVT. So I've been trying to. That's micromanaging. You I have the laws from above, and then you have all right, with all these crappy regulations, we have to make something that's kind of good. So I've been trying to poke at different programs oh, you can make something about trans, please include me so I can make sure you don't spout out crap. Talking about Korrespondenterna last autumn, if somebody saw it, that was crap. Oh my God, I hope my bosses don't see this. So the thing is and when especially in my line of work, you see that, and I think everybody knows this, that the people who are lifted up are almost always white trans feminine people, right? Or non-binary AFABs that pass as female, So what we're trying to do, or what I'm trying to do in my workplace and also in RFSL Youth, is trying to lift up other, I don't know if role models is the best word to use, but try to address the representativity, kind of.
I don't know if this is helpful, but one thing, I really liked your example about the subway rule, the rules in the train station. One of the things I think that I've seen a lot of people who are trying to reimagine queer and trans activism do is figure out that we need to focus on systems and issues that might not have our name on them. So it's not it's sometimes the thing that's really, really harming queer and trans youth is the cops picking them up in the train station, or it's a law or a policy or a administrative cycle that doesn't say on its face, and it even says it's good for gay or trans people, but it's really so it's less looking at what systems say about us and more what they're doing to us, and then sometimes picking our reform targets based on that. So there's some people doing youth work in different jurisdictions in the U.S. that are looking at how can youth get emancipated from their parents, and it has really high stakes for a lot of queer and trans youth, being able to get emancipated from their parents, get their own benefits, or apply for things without having their parents in the same legally in the same system, like that it doesn't say trans anywhere on it, but it's huge. Or there's a million things like that, or things around prison healthcare or prison nutrition, like is there enough food in prisons? I've had this experience sometimes of working with people on policy issues. Like I was working on this policy document that was about like federal policies around criminalization of LGBT people, and I was working with a bunch of other like scholars and activists, and we wanted to talk about prison nutrition in the document, in the prison conditions section. But there was someone else who said the prison conditions section should only say, we want an LGBT non-discrimination policy in the Bureau of Prisons. And he said, the nutrition issue, that's not a queer and trans issue. And so that kind of thinking, like the difference between understanding that that is a queer and trans issue, that queer and trans people are extremely affected by prison nutrition problems, and that it doesn't have to say, like, LGBT on it for it to be our issue, and then also we build like a solidarity and maybe build more effective activism sometimes when we do that work together. Like that's, I think, kind of a conceptual problem sometimes in our activist settings. I don't know what that looks like here. It sounds like you're all already onto that, but that's one thing I've noticed. Yeah.
But it's also, I'm really happy that you brought it up. I think it's also about working in silos as an issue, LGBTQI issue, which sometimes becomes it can become very empty word, because we are impacted by many different aspects, right? And we face very similar issues as different groups, but we just we have a very tunnel vision sometimes, which is we can't work like this.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, we were talking about something that was a particular bugbear of mine, which is we talked about the depathologization of trans. I wrote a paper about a year ago where I sort of said, well, we end up talking very tunnel visioned about this issue. We must depathologize trans because we're stigmatized as a mental health condition. Trans people are stigmatized because we have this condition. But of course, one of the practical upshots of that in certain situations where you have state healthcare, if you don't get a diagnosis, you can't get state healthcare, right? So there is a fight there. Well, my thought was simply this: let's look at disability rights activism in crip theory, which says we don't have to have that fight if we simply destigmatize mental health. If we destigmatize the condition, it doesn't matter whether or not you have one or not, because it's not the condition that's the problem, it's your access issues, right? It's the medical versus social model of disability, which I think is really, really useful. We look at something like, well, it's not what you have, you're not the problem, it's the culture around you that is not allowing you to access that. So what's the easiest situation? Change each individual or change the culture? Well, right now we have a culture that's designed to focus on the individual. Christine Bieland, who's in the audience, I'm sure could tell you a lot about that in the Swedish context. But in this particular situation, I think there's a lot to learn from looking outside of our own community, and we can create those combined activisms. We can look at issues that we all face that influence each other no matter what group it specifically pertains to. And I think this is the resolution to a very complex problem with a complex solution, but it's one of them.
Yeah. Does some of you want to pick up the thread there, or maybe I pose a new question then? Yeah.
I think I was thinking earlier this week we were having a conversation about, this writer Lisa Dugan. She wrote in this book maybe like 10 years ago about the idea of homonormativity, the idea that what contemporary politics is trying to create is like a demobilized gay and lesbian constituency who will like ally with existing like consumer culture and military culture. And so like it imagined we are like a set of people whose politics and whose lives can be claimed so that we can become allies to the existing system instead of participating in movements to dismantle those systems. And I think about that a lot. It's like we're supposed to forget what's actually affecting us and buy into the idea that like narrative, like just saying that we're like getting it changed in the law so that it says we're good people and not bad people, which won't really do much usually, will be enough. So how do we refuse to be kind of moved into that demobilized place and instead remember like what's actually harming us, like my friend got picked up in the train station, my friend can't eat in prison. Like how can we kind of break the spell of like this promise that if you're recognized your life will become better, and instead just look around at what's actually happening in our lives. And I feel like that's a lot of what happens in the organizing projects that I've been a part of, where people just come together in a room and talk about like what are some of the hardest things happening. just like, and actually tell each other like about their experiences. Like, oh, for me, this thing is happening with my immigration status. For me, I'm having this trouble with housing, or I'm having this trouble with the police. And then, okay, let's come up together with, okay, who else is working on these issues in our communities? Maybe non-queer organizations, maybe organizations that have some queers in them. Are there any campaigns going on? Maybe there's ways to be part of a mobilized queer and trans constituency around broad issues, and also highlight our specific vulnerabilities inside places like prisons or with the police or in the migration system. So it's not separate from broad social movements, although it is a particular contribution, and also is maybe working on homophobia and transphobia and other parts of our same movements, rather than like this kind of take us out and align us with the state because of some like thin promises. It's like a very, it's like it's, to me, it's actually organic. It's like what we already actually know is going on in our lives, but we're kind of forget to see it or something.
Yeah. Somebody wants to relate to what Dean was saying?
Yeah, I was thinking about like in the Swedish context, because like a lot of like the recent victories we had in Sweden haven't been like through like bartering with the political parties, but have been like through the judicial system, that we like try to make a ruckus, or like made a ruckus actually, and that like tells us that like the political parties are not seldom our allies in a way. Just thinking about that.
Someone speaking up? That's right. I'm wondering if I can post a question about who is being left out of or heard less than others in trans and queer activism in Sweden. Whose concerns are being marginalized? Like if we can try to put words on that, and what can we do to shift that? Someone wants to.
Yeah, I think mainly like we're the group we're forgetting are the people who are like, what's called frihetsberövade. What's that called in English? Incarcerated, exactly. Because we have like, at least in my organization, we have almost no work regarding that, in RFSL almost none either. So like what we're trying to do now is trying to especially lift up the problems that like migrants are having, and like trying to start new projects. And we like had. This is like bragging a bit, but we just got a big project from Allmänna arvsfonden. So we're gonna like start this huge project, directly targeting people who are like new arrived or like living illegally in Sweden, because that's like the same thing like the situation with trans people in general, like 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's like the situation with people with unsecure migration status right now.
I think for me, and it will go to the devil is always in the detail. When, for instance, when we push for having trans-inclusive language and policies or whatever, and there is a word trans included, I think for me it's still very much about binary. It's trans people who decide or they identify with either with female or male identities, and then which means that everybody else is left out. And so my question always is how to make it applicable for people who are outside of the binary. So it's like putting a system into place, but it has to come with tools around it. So it needs to be implemented so it can be applicable for many, many of us. But that's a challenge for now. And then it goes through, that there is very rarely intersectional approach. So it's very often, I'm pretty sure it's about white trans people who we have in mind when we put things in different documents. So that's the step that is happening, at least right now for me.
Yeah, I'm going to follow on. There's going to be add something else, but I'm going to follow on that. It's very difficult to deal with these sort of definitions. Is that, like, for example, on a policy level in the UK when the law for the right to change your birth certificate was fought for. The UK was very, very reluctant to do anything for trans people. It was one of the last countries in the EU to change their law. They were taken to the European Court of Human Rights in order to change that law. And the successful argument was made that because you couldn't change your legal gender in the UK, you couldn't get married in the gender that you identified with. And it was marriage, the right to marriage, that was used to change that law. So the law changed. And it was significant improvement, and there were some good things in there. For example, you didn't have to go through any medical procedures to get certain rights to change your birth certificate. But it was still based on this binary, and still based on this idea that you had to go from one to the other. And in the UK, you still have to go to a court of law and promise in front of them on Scout's honor that I am going to be whatever gender you're choosing to be, and never change it back ever again. Again, promise, promise, promise. And that's the law, but it's based only on that. Any protections you can get is based on binary gender and marriage specifically. So that's how the law was changed. And that permeates every quality of that law, right? Even though it has some good elements, it has that in it, and you can see it through it. So now now the problem is any rights that are being based on that law require you to have gone to court to promise, 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 and get a piece of paper that you put on the wall. But if you don't get that piece of paper, can you have those rights? And if you fit between the two boxes, you're going to struggle. In Sweden, I've had this thing about personal numbers. Yeah, in Sweden, you have this national security number that you have to present everywhere you go, no matter what you do, where you go. If you want to rent a movie, you use this thing. It drove me nuts. I couldn't believe it. And this personal number has a series of 4 digits. The Swedish people will know this. The last of which tells you which gender the person is. And you use that number everywhere. And it's one or the other, male, female. And you could, for a while, you could only change it if you were sterilized in this country. There was a prerequisite to be sterilized to get that number changed, that little number, which means so much because you have to show it everywhere. It also includes your age, by the way, which I think is really scary because it just allows for all kinds of things. So when we went to I remember we went to social services in the government and talked about this, and my suggestion was, well, we've got this lovely law now that means that you don't have to be sterilized to change the number, but why don't we just get rid of the number? Wouldn't that solve the problem? Like, we could have a theme tune. Like, we could replace it with anything.
Open your passport and
there's the theme tune. You know, it could represent you a little bit more directly, right? But it was like the problem allows for this binary that so few people are going to be able to. They have to go through certain processes and have access to those processes in order to do it, whether they're documented, whether they're poor, whether they can't access, whether they don't know, whether they're from this country or not. Those things are all part of that problem. If you, yeah, I could go on, but that's my thing.
Yeah, the time is running quite fast. I think we should, if there is someone who wants to comment on that, and I want to give time for the audience also, so maybe we open for the audience actually, so that there is some time to discuss with everybody. And I think I just pose one big question, but you can comment on whatever. You can comment on Dean's lecture earlier, you can comment on what you have been discussing on the panel, but maybe we can reflect a bit together also, like, where do we want to go from here? What are we doing, and what do we want to do? What is our activism? How do we want to work? Yeah.
Yeah, what are we doing? So, hi everybody. I just wanted to bring something up about the difference between America and Sweden, which is so, it makes the biggest change for the way that we have organized the way we speak about rights. And that's the state, of course. So basically, like, the examples that you brought up always included how the state is so oppressive. If you look at the history of social movement, social justice movement in Sweden, the state is the key. So we've had anti-racist movement that is targeting and addressing the government for equal rights. Of course, you have the feminism movement and our current movement. So how can we, what does that do to our activism? And especially now, maybe the last 10, 20 years when we've had a new economic policy in Sweden, a sort of right-wing government that has completely transformed the welfare system, plus the rise of racism. Are we still oriented toward the state? Or are the new social movements organizing in a way where it's not mainly about demanding a right from your government? I just don't know where we're gonna go from here.
I think it's a very important question about the way we relate to the state differently than in the United States, and also how we are being confronted with the way in which we relate to the state when something's changing in the state, sort of. I don't know, either someone on the panel wants, Yolanda.
Yeah, I think that our heritage from the state is that we're more gullible, that we put more trust in the state and we rely on it, and that makes it so that now when it's getting fucked up, we don't have the backbone to do anything. We don't have the structures or the organizational structures. If you live in a country that has a history of more, I don't know, fighting or more oppression in some kind, where my parents are from Chile, then you know what you have to do when the state turns sour. But here in Sweden, we don't know what to do now. So I think all our movements and all the anti-racist movement, LGBTQI movement, all the movements are trying to find our places now in this new political climate, I think. So that makes it even more important that we have intersectional cooperations between all the movements.
Someone else in the audience? Yes.
Thank you, Yolanda. Brilliant. I want to broaden maybe the discussion on intersection between ableist and transphobic discourse, because I think that in crip theory the notion of demedicalization is central, and I also think that it's not necessarily the diagnosis, but the relation with the welfare system that you've all discussed that becomes central here, that in an ableist society and also in a transphobic society that's based on such a relationship with the welfare state as we have in Sweden right now, state recognition is crucial for human rights, and state recognition is crucial for livable lives. I think we have a situation in Sweden right now where people with disabilities and trans people and migrants and so forth depend not necessarily on societal recognition as such, but on legal recognition, and sometimes profoundly so as sort of medicalized subjects and objects, to be able to not only be perceived sort of culturally or be representative in media or in policy documents, but to be able to access fundamental human rights. And I think that's really the key point in this sort of neoliberal society that we've created now, that in Sweden we've created this notion of state recognition that gives certain subjects livable lives and others not. So I think that's really an important intersection that you all have been bringing up. Thank you.
I'd love to say one thing about that. One thing I really like about that book by Harsha Walia, Undoing Border Imperialism, is she talks about something that I think is it's been a huge theme in my life and my work. I've done a lot of work to help people, to be part of the struggles to get people state benefits, to get people who are being denied disability benefits or welfare benefits of different kinds. And to me, that work can go a lot, direct support for people navigating, or immigration status, to navigating a particular state system of recognition alongside a critique of state control and those systems. And she has I don't remember it perfectly, but she has this 5-factor, how does no one is legal, think that through, how do you balance that? It's because it's a contradiction, right? Because we know we want people in our communities to survive right now, which often means navigating some messed up hearing where you're trying to be recognized by the state as somebody who deserves this money or this housing or this label that might get you something you need to survive. And also we critique that whole process, and we want to build, our dream might be to build a society in which nobody has to go through a process like that to get what they need to survive. And I think that it relates to Lavin's point about how our movements simultaneously have to address the state because we're experiencing state violence, and also navigate the existence of those processes, while I do think there is a turn in a lot of conversations I'm in different movements toward kind of waking up from that gullibleness that I think that fantasy about the state exists even very heavily in the United States, even though the state is so much more overtly, based in colonialism and racism and slavery. That tension to me is an interesting one, and there's a lot of ways that people in, I think, critical disability studies and also in movement work that does direct support to poor people are theorizing that. Harsha Walia is one person. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think it's also a position that's often overlooked in more utopian queer and crip discussions, that there are certain people, not subjects, but people who are dependent directly on state welfare to have their human rights and their livelihoods carried out. So that's really important.
Other comments or questions in the audience? Someone on the panel who wants to comment on the...
I guess I just would like to add to that. I think, it does get to me, because I sort of exist in this weird space between things, and sometimes that's really useful and sometimes it's really disappointing, because it means I tend not to get a wage for anything consistently, right? But it does mean that I sort of I've located myself in academia and looked at high theory about something, and this is how we sort of understand gender as one of the biggest problems that everybody faces. That we can talk about sexuality and sexual rights and gender identity, but it often comes down to gender, the problems of sexist society, right? And the same thing goes here. We can talk about wanting to deconstruct a really problematic cultural institution, because we know theoretically and even on a very genuine level that it is problematic, and that is the ultimate goal. And yet we have to survive the system as it is, as individuals who live a life on the ground and don't have the privilege to not engage with that system. How can we both deconstruct the system and also, as you pointed out, deal with it as it is? And I think one of the things you mentioned, is the, sometimes in certain rhetorics we end up, we can even end up arguing against certain people who simply don't fit our theoretical rhetoric. Those people who pass or feel they need to vanish into society, or simply want to, in order to survive and remain safe. On any... I know me personally, I may be raw here, but when I go on the street, I know I'm going to be nervous. I got attacked a couple of days ago, and I'm feeling it now. And I'm like, okay, how can I survive my day navigating a sexist society that I don't agree with, and then at night turn into a superhero and fight the sexist society and do the same thing? It can be a contradiction that can actually tear communities apart, and we can end up arguing on a level. I think it's really important to both deal with the practicalities of that and also continue to deconstruct. And I think that's why I'm all about multiple levels of attack and multiple understandings. For me, I'm hugely about cultural and satire. I think one of the biggest solutions to Swedish society is humor. Like making fun of it, which I do regularly for profit. But it's also like, I think that helps. But I'm lucky enough to do it, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think it's a really good point. Well taken. Thanks.
Other questions that comes up now? Not overlooking anyone.
I mean, we could sit here and make fun of Sweden. I mean, that's not... it's dangerous. I'm being... Yay, Sweden!
Yeah, maybe humor is something that we need more of. Yeah, no more questions from you.
Well,
maybe I could just ask the panel over here. I think, Ivo, you talked about sort of where we want to go or what we want to do. I think it would be nice to maybe just then, if there are no further questions from the audience, but just maybe then have the panelists sort of reflect on what they would like to see in the sort of shorter term, I think, practical changes in their specific activism, and also maybe then a longer term goal, because obviously we have these utopian ideas of how we would like society to be, but obviously then in each individual person is working in a very specific area of activism in that sense. So maybe a sort of a shorter term wish or goal and a longer term, maybe just to sort of positively end on the discussion, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. It's a very good way of ending. Maybe we start with Dean and go that direction.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a really huge question. Awesome. A couple of things I'll say.
You've got 8 minutes, Dean, to answer.
A couple of things I'll say about it is, I think one focus in a lot of the work that I'm involved in is building kind of a critical mass in particular movements. Like and having people in movements have critical capacities beyond a single issue. So part of that is like in Seattle for the last 8 years, I've been working on different programs to try to stop different jails from being built and immigration detention centers from being expanded with a set of people. So we want people to see that as a queer issue, see that as a feminist issue, see that as an anti-racist issue, right? So that people who are in siloed movements that are kind of separate can kind of have the capacity to be in solidarity and work together, right? And so even having that be articulated as a queer issue has been or a feminist issue has been a really significant piece. And then also just building the sheer scale of movements is a huge concern. There's a kind of numerous things that are depoliticizing people and demobilizing people. And so trying to think about how do we build movements of scale that are deeply critical and where people have broad leadership capacities and that are movements that are not hierarchical but instead horizontal and really allow people to be really creative. And which is part of why I study organizations like No One Is Illegal, because it's a decentralized group using different strategies in different Canadian cities and being really responsive to, and they don't have a budget, they don't have an organization with money from corporations or the government telling them what to do. It's a very grassroots strategy. So that to me is really important. And one other thing I'll say about this is that I've been personally really invested in trying to get critical ideas that help people read propaganda and read situations with solidarity, getting those ideas into broader circulation. So I've been making a lot of short films where people I think are smart say stuff because I think the idea that people have to write it all down and then everyone has to read is a very unrealistic way to share ideas. So I just want to tell you all that I hope that you'll look up some of these film projects and see some of these brilliant people who I've been trying to put in front of the camera. A lot of them are on the website of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and I can give you that information later. But I feel like all of us, how can we produce more of these critical ideas circulating in art and video and music and poetry? How can we produce because also our movements should be fun and exciting and creative and sexy, and it's not all about meetings and panels, So I think that's been a question for me, especially in the last 5 years or so, is moving from the page to other more visual engagements with the kinds of ideas that we've been talking about.
That was a lot of inspirational ideas, I think. Yeah.
Well, I'll pick up right from there, actually, because that'll be my short-term goal. I'm an artist. I'm a performer at heart. I love communicating ideas as simply as possible in a community way. I grew up in London where we made art without permission because no one was going to fund us. So we went into bars and stood on stages and tried to tell our stories to as many people as possible. And for me, that cultural communication is absolutely crucial to our community. I think it's in part how we formed our collective organizing. And that history is very well documented. For me, it's about creating spaces. That's it. It's as simple as that. For panels, for discussions that are accessible and genuinely accessible and gives voice to those people who often don't get voice because the arts often will allow for that. It's a language that is more universal sometimes than sitting on a panel or speaking to a group. You can use those things to communicate experiences that don't yet have words, that aren't yet recognized. And this is me being very philosophical, but this is how I feel about the arts, and it is my feeling of communal safe spaces where we can have these discussions, where we can disagree and form these ideas and have those critical masses. And I think that's one of the sort of grassroots things that I think are essential. It's why I'm so happy about TransFest. It's one of those organizations. I'm going to try and run small clubs at some point in the future if we can ever find an accessible venue in Stockholm. I don't know why that is such an issue, but something like that, you know, creating spaces and environments for those discussions. On a more macro level, yeah, that constant discussion across identity, that we have this identity politics that we find we're so invested in because we need to be recognized by the state or communities. So we put identities in little boxes. But to be able to sort of disintegrate those ideas and to talk about issue politics that are across identities that we can come together on and hopefully communicate.
Yeah,
and that would be my longer term.
So grassroots creation of spaces, and then Micah.
Yeah, and I will pick on your last argument or wish, and see it as our homework for the movement to see exactly the issues and where we can come together to create progress. And the other one is when human rights were brought up earlier. And we usually have this really dreamy idea of it, and that everybody has human rights and they should have access and so on. And then very often when we come to specific identity or issues, there's a but coming, especially from authorities or decision makers. And I would really, this is like an ideal, right? I would really love not to hear the but in spaces where people are in place to protect us. I don't want to hear the but.
So no buts.
No buts.
Yolanda.
Try and follow that without a joke, Yolanda.
You trying to make me the butt of the joke? Yeah, all right. So I'm a comedian also, actually. Not true. Yeah, so the thing is that I'm like on like double chairs because on one hand I have like an anarchist background, like in my current capacity I'm like the vice president of an organization, and I have to like we have to talk with the cops, we have to talk with the healthcare system, we have to talk with everybody, and like a part of me just feels like, couldn't we just like maybe occupy a city and like rob a what's called a hospital, and then we have everything that we need, kind of. So I think that like we need like, it's called a multi-pronged attack. I think it's called like a strategy on many different levels. Like we have to build like these parallel utopias where everybody can like be themselves and express themselves like they are and everything, but at the same time like be super aggressive towards like the state and the institutions and stuff. But also like the oh yeah,
my daughter
stuff. Oh right, hi daughter. But also like the thing that you said about the arts, like because the only thing that's like super LGBTQI in Sweden is like Melodifestivalen, and how fun is that, really? We like need a kind of a broader arts movement. I think like we have some artists here, like book us. Yeah, that's my last request. Thanks.
I think we end with that. Book us.
We're available.
So, hopefully you all enjoyed that very engaging and inspiring panel, following an also equally engaging and inspiring talk from Dean. On behalf of Trans Film Fest Stockholm, I'd like to thank you all for coming and participating. And I also very specially want to thank Yolanda, Micah, Josephine, Dean and Ivo for their contributions and their input and their support also for coming here today. Before I give them their thank you gifts, I just want to remind you, we have to hurry up. I just want to remind you that you're all very welcome to the mingle or sort of gathering downstairs in the cafe. And also, if you are interested in future Trans Film Fest events, we hope to have something around Stockholm Pride. So you can find us on Facebook, Trans Film Fest Stockholm as well. So thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you.